Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/ShelbyForsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hi there, grief growers, and welcome to Grief Book Roundup. Thank you so much for joining me today. On this episode, I am bringing you a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I found this book because a botanical artist that I follow on Instagram mentions that she listens to Braiding Sweetgrass on a regular basis when she is painting flowers and plants. And after giving the book a listen myself, I did listen to the audiobook. I can see why. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a mother, a scientist, a decorated professor, and an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, paints simultaneously throughout this book a humbling, haunting, glorious, intimate story of humans' relationship to nature through a generous offering of chapters covering everything from pecans to sweetgrass, rivers to wild strawberries. Kimmerer connects us to Earth using story, science, and indigenous language. Braiding Sweetgrass is a perfect companion book for grief because you can take what you need every single time you listen, and for me it's been something different each time. Sometimes I have taken away gratitude for the ground underneath my feet and the sky above my head, and gratitude can be a tricky thing in grief. Sometimes I have taken away something harder and deeper, something like communal mourning for the environmental losses that we and our shared planet continue to endure. And sometimes I get to take away deep acknowledgement of the duality that resides in all of us, all creation, the ability to destroy through grief and anger, and the ability to create through appreciation and community. If I had to pick 3 words to describe this book, they would be soothing, intertwining, and appreciative. Soothing because Robin Wall Kimmerer's voice, her writing voice, her speaking voice, is tender, is intimate. She wants you to get to know the land. She wants you to feel nourished by its gifts and by its medicines and by its stories and by its wisdom. She wants you to know that the earth is a place where you can rest, and in grief, that's something that's intensely, intensely comforting. Intertwining because, as the title states, braiding sweetgrass, we are more connected to nature than our society lets on. Some of us get to know this better in grief, and some of us need a little reminding when we are at our deepest places of despair and heartbreak inside of loss. Oftentimes, grief can be such a disconnecting experience, and so much of Kimmerer's work in this book is to reconnect, to literally plug us back into the ground underneath our feet. And appreciative because in every single chapter of this book, there resides wonder, marvel, awe, and gratitude, not necessarily for what our lives contain as people, but for where and how we are contained by the earth. There's even an entire chapter dedicated to a prayer of thanksgiving that Indigenous people give, that Kimmerer offers as a gift to all of her readers. In terms of losses included in this book, environmental loss is the dominant loss in Braiding Sweetgrass. This shows up through Kimmerer's reflections on human loss of connection to the land, the pollution and destruction of nature due to corporate and political greed, and the devastating loss of places and species, especially those that are historically and spiritually precious to Indigenous people. Additionally, Kimmerer grieves for herself and all Indigenous nations that have suffered the devastating grief of forced assimilation through residential schools, the grief of violent removal from home and homeland, the grief of genocide, the grief of invasive plants and human diseases brought to Indigenous people by colonizers, and the grief of language and culture that has been lost and oftentimes forcibly erased in history and present. Some of my favorite quotes from this book include this very simple but powerful one from some of the beginning chapters that reads, "The land knows you, even when you are lost." Another quote I love from this book reads, "I've heard it said that sometimes, in return for the gifts of the earth, gratitude is enough. It is our uniquely human gift to express thanks because we have the awareness and the collective memory to remember that the world could well be otherwise, less generous than it is. But I think we are called to go beyond cultures of gratitude, to once again become cultures of reciprocity." And lastly, I'd love to leave you with this quote from Braiding Sweetgrass. Joanna Macy writes that until we can grieve for our planet, we cannot love it. Grieving is a sign of spiritual health. But it is not enough to weep for our lost landscapes. We have to put our hands in the earth to make ourselves whole again. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. So grief growers, if you are longing to be connected to something in the aftermath of whatever loss you are facing, I would love to see you pick up a copy or listen to a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. In it, you will not only find permission to grieve for yourself and the world, but permission to appreciate and to honor the world that we are surrounded by daily. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.